All right, so welcome. My name is Chris Wildermuth. I'm welcome you to this webinar. I'm excited to see how the series is going. I've been very happy with the response of the community, and it's really fun to be able to offer these webinars on behalf of Drake University. So let me see if my computer decides to work. This is just if anybody's having any trouble, or if you have a colleague who's having trouble, just go to zoom.us page or call 1-888-799-9666 and press 2 for support. That's just in case there's somebody on the phone who needs some help. Okay, I always start the programs with a different picture of Rio de Janeiro. So let me see a show of hands. How many of you have already been in other webinars that I ran this semester? Anybody has? Oh, I'm seeing lots of hands. Well, thank you for coming back. And this is yet one more picture of Rio de Janeiro. Hey, at least I bring different ones every time. So this gorgeous city is where I am from. And I'm an associate professor at Drake University. I coordinate the Master of Science in Leadership Development. And this is a program with a very strong component of developing leadership competencies or building leadership capacity in self and others. So it's a program for people who are interested in building their own leadership capacity, people who are interested in developing leadership in others, or people who are interested in the study, in an advanced study of leadership. Our program is competency-based, so we did an extensive research on leadership competencies and selected the ones that seemed to be present or prevalent in most of the leadership models to date. Our classes are for working adults, so we teach them on Friday evenings and Saturdays during the day, and we're now accepting applications for the spring. So if you're interested in starting in the spring, please get in touch with me and I'll give you some more information. Okay. Enough about that. In terms of this program, I often have many people who attend these webinars are interested in the SHRM or the PHR, SPHR certification number. Let me have a show of hands. How many of you in attendance are actually interested in that? So that I can have a sense. Okay, several of you. So according to the regulations of both SHRM and HRCI, I cannot provide that information until later in the program when the program is over. So if you're interested in these numbers, please stay until the end. And also, don't worry if you don't catch it immediately as I say it, because I'm going to send you an email with those numbers at the end. The slides and handouts, actually the slides, what I did is I put directly the PowerPoint profile, and it's in that page on the screen. And again, don't worry about it, this is too long, but I will be sending you an email after the workshop. You should receive it in 24 hours, both with the HRCI and the SHRM numbers, and also with the location of the PowerPoint slides and the recording. I'm recording this presentation. And here's something I'm doing new this time, a shameless research plug. I have my colleague Rubens Pesanya, a very good friend, is completing his dissertation, and I promised to help him. He's running a study on connections between, he's trying to understand why people don't pass or pass, what differentiates passing or not passing the SPHR exam. And my understanding is that it takes only about 15 minutes to complete that exam. Let's see, Rubens, are you there?
I am, Chris, and thank you so much.
Okay, I think you can explain your study a little bit better. Is the relationship between passing the SPHR exam and what?
It's we are exploring thinking styles, emotional intelligence, and certification achievement.
Okay.
And yeah, and so it's passing or failing the SPHR.
Okay, thank you so much, Rubens. So I put the address. I put the address on the screen, and I'm also going to have this on the email. I always have a very soft spot for anybody doing research because I'm always on that boat. So if you would have it in you to send this research to anybody you know who may not have passed the SPHR exam, that's exactly what Rubens is looking for to complete his dissertation. So let's help him become Dr. Pesanya. Okay, and with all that said, let's talk about what we're here for, which is to discuss 360. So this is the road we'll travel this is what we're going to be talking about. First, what is a 360 feedback? Let's start with definitions. Second, some pros and cons of running a 360 process. And finally, I'm going to be discussing some best practices. Okay, so before we get just one more thing, you've been in other presentations, so you know that even though I have a script, I very often ignore my script and I just go on, and I want to keep this flexible and interactive, and I want to be able to answer some questions. So please forgive some of the imperfections and the ums and the ahs. I can't make it perfect and interactive at the same time because I would get totally lost. So there will be, I will have a couple of polls right in the beginning, and then throughout the presentation, sometimes I'll ask you to send me your thoughts or give me that input. And I'm trying to create as much as possible an environment in which we're not together in the same room, but we feel as if we were. So please do not hesitate to ask me questions. I may not be able to answer them immediately, but I'll try to answer them every so often. And if at the end of the presentation there are questions that I wasn't able to answer, we can just communicate by email about them. Okay? All right, and that takes us to my very first poll. Let me see how that works. And I'm going to launch it now. And this first poll has to do with your experience with 360s. So you can mark as many options as you wish. And the questions are, or the items are, I have developed 360s, I have facilitated feedback for many 360s, I have facilitated feedback for some 360s, I have received 360 feedback, I have coordinated 360 processes, or I have no experience whatsoever with 360s. And that will give us will give me a sense of what my group is all about, and I will share the results with you, and you'll also see who is in the room. So let me give you just a little more time to finish this. Okay, let's see how many of you have voted. Sometimes, by the way, if you can't see those polls, don't worry, there will only be about one more of them. And very often what happens is that there is something in your browser that does not allow you to see it, some kind of setting in the browser. Okay, yeah. And by the way, if you ever want to answer a poll question and you're not seeing the poll, just send it to me by chat, and I'll see what you have there. So one of you just did just that. Okay, so let me end the poll and show you what I have. Share results. So according to our results, I have a bit of everything. I don't have anybody who has facilitated lots and lots of 360s or developed 360s, but the people who answered have been involved in 360s in some way. A few of you have not had any experience with 360s, so that gives me kind of a sense of where we are. Okay, and now let me go to the second poll. And the next poll has to do with, let me get this here. Now this time I want to know if your experience with 360s were, if the experiences were positive or negative. And this time just pick one. Either you can say you have had no experience with 360, or most experiences were positive, most experiences were negative, and your experiences have been mixed. And again, if you want to answer that by chat because you can't see the, because you can't actually see the poll, then feel free to do that. Good question. Somebody's saying, what is a 360? Which of course is the first thing that I'm going to go through after this poll, but I probably should have started by telling you what I'm talking about. A 360, also called a multi-rater assessment, is an assessment. Yikes, what do I have pretty in my definitions here? It's a type of feedback that is provided by everybody around you. So you receive feedback from your manager, from your subordinates, from your colleagues, from your customers, from people, from everybody around you. That's what a 360 is. See, that's what happens when I go off script. Okay, so let me end the poll here and share the results with you. So nobody said most of my experiences have been negative. I have some people said positive, some people said mixed. Actually, 8 of you said that your experiences were mixed. And then 2 people have had no experiences with 360s. Okay. Thank you for that. That gives me a little bit of a sense. And there will be some other moments in the presentation in which I will ask you to actually share some of those experiences, good or bad, or maybe participate in some of the best practice discussions. So here we go. So now I have my script. What is a 360 feedback process? What are we talking about? So the official definition is on the screen, a process in which a person receives anonymous feedback from subordinates, peers, bosses, and customers, or really from everybody around you. So that's why it's called a 360, what you have on the screen there. And in fact, you may be noticing customers in the 360 circle. And that is a very strong recommendation made. And when I say customers, I mean both internal customers and external customers. I'm curious about something. Can you raise your hand if you have participated in a 360 process involving customers? Anybody? I have a couple of you who said yes. Okay. It's not very common. More often than not, people have just the right side of my circle here, the peers, the subordinates, and the managers. Sometimes there's a category for other, and then people just add more people there. I don't know if you knew that, but actually the idea started in the 1960s with a group of psychologists from the Peace Corps. And the purpose was to come up with a process that would benefit the testees as well as the Peace Corps itself. And since then, it has become very widespread. I was looking for some statistics, and the one that I found was relatively old. It was from 2010, and it said that 90% of the Fortune 500 companies in the U.S. have some sort of a 360. I could not find statistics, though, on what percentage of managers or leaders or professionals in general take part in 360s. Anecdotally, from talking to my graduate students and my colleagues in HR, it seems that it's usually something reserved for people in the higher echelons or in the upper level leaders. Usually it's not extended to mid-level managers or supervisors or coordinators or professionals in general, which is a pity, and it's happening mostly because of cost. So we can talk about this a little bit more later on because there are some options for you to do this in lower cost. Okay. You all are probably familiar with the Johari window. How many of you are familiar with the Johari window? Raise your hand if you are. Is anybody familiar with it? And I see a few. Let me ask this question differently. How many of you do not have a clue what I'm talking about when I say the Johari window? Well, I ask it this way. Okay, and I actually have more people, so I think I'd better stop assuming things. Thank you for that. So here's what we talk about when we say the Johari window. This was actually set up by two psychologists. Their names were Joseph Luft, I don't know how to pronounce his name, and Harry Ingham, and thus Johari because Joseph, and Harry. And as I review each portion of the model, think of yourself and think of what that may mean for you. So there are 4 windows, and the top one is called public, then the top right-hand corner is blind, then lower left-hand corner is private, and then unknown. Don't worry, I'm going to go through each of those. So first, let's talk about the public one. It's also called the arena, and it includes information that is known both to yourself and to others. So think of something that most people who know you reasonably well, of course, when I say public, it has to do with the public that surrounds you, not everybody under the sun, but people who know you reasonably well, perhaps people who work with you, would know that about you, and you concur with that information. So for example, if you asked my graduate students, I don't know if I have any of them do I have any of my graduate students in the participant list? If you're there, show up. And nobody raised a hand, so I don't think so. But if you were my graduate student, you would probably know that I hardly ever follow my PowerPoints in class. In fact, the only time that I actually follow my PowerPoints is when I'm running a webinar. This is public. Everybody knows that about myself, and I also know that, and it's definitely not a secret. Okay, so that's that corner. Then the lower part is called private, and that's that includes everything that you know about yourself, but that you choose not to disclose. So can you think of anything like that right now? You don't have to answer, but think of that for you. And what's interesting about that private part is that it depends on the group. So some things could be private for maybe the people with whom you work, but public if you compare with, if you think about your family or your closest friends. So we can have bigger or smaller private rooms, I suppose, depending on what we're talking about. Then we have the blind spot, the blind window. And that's the area that has traits and characteristics that other people know about me, but I'm blissfully unaware of them. Those are the things that people say behind your back. And I know that it's here's a little cultural tidbit. I know the presentation on culture is only coming up in a month from now, but one thing that I noticed, being from originally from Brazil and having been in the United States, I immigrated a long time ago, almost 25 years ago now, is that in the US, when you say things such as talking about you behind your back or not being direct, people very often have a reaction to that, or a negative reaction that's considered perhaps dishonest, or I don't know, it feels crappy to people. And I used to say to my friends, hey, if you want to say something bad about me, go ahead and say it behind my back, because then I don't have to deal with it. And that's because in my own background, being very direct and saying things to people sometimes feels very rude and disrespectful. So perhaps the blind spot doesn't feel as bad to me as it feels for some of you. That's just a little cultural scenario. But at all events, that's what the blind spot means, is that others know that, and those things that you don't know about yourself and others do, they could even be impacting your career, they could be impacting your progress, they could be impacting the way people relate to you, but you won't know because it's a blind spot. Okay? And finally, we have the clueless box, and that's the one that nobody knows. I'm unconscious of them, and you are unaware of them. So one of the purposes of having a 360 process, as you can imagine, is to shrink the blind spot, is to reduce it, is to make sure that the things that you know about me, you as my colleague, my student, my peer, my customer, whomever, that the things that you know about me, that I also know about them, so that I can do something about it. Okay, that's kind of the idea. It's also to enhance communications and to perhaps increase the size of your public self. Of course, that second piece would depend on what you do after the 360. So if you ask for feedback and you receive it, but you don't share any of the feedback back, you don't have any conversation with your peers or your colleagues, hey, here's what I heard from you, here's what I'm planning to do, then nothing is going to happen with the public box, only with the blind one. Okay, if this sounds a little complicated, what I'm going to do is, after this presentation, give me a couple of days, but I will go back to that web page that I gave you in the beginning, and I'll look for some resources on the Johari window, because there's some really interesting group exercises that you can do using this model, and it's just a cool model for team building purposes and so on. And I will put the links to those on my website after we're done. Okay, so now that I told you what a 360 feedback process means and where it comes from, what the purpose of a 360 feedback is, let's start straight with some of the pros and cons of having a 360 feedback to begin with. All right, so let's start first with the pros, the good stuff. The first one, let me move this down because okay, got it. So the first one is that the 360 allows you to hear different perspectives, and it also helps you to see how you're handling multiple roles. Most of us we wear different hats. Like, I'm thinking of myself, I wear the hat of a professor, but I also wear the hat of a colleague, a peer, collaborating in one of the endless committees that people like to have in universities so much. I also wear the hat of a colleague, perhaps in a professional association that I could participate in, and so on. So we all have different things that we do, and we could be perceived differently by different groups, and a 360 would allow you to see how you're actually handling those multiple hats or roles. So not only you get a general feedback about how you're doing from the perspective of your manager, which is kind of the typical thing we get, but you also get that feedback from a variety of people. All right, let's see, what else do I have here in terms of pro? Another good thing is that you are less likely to discount the perspective of one person because you're getting it from multiple sources. So let's say that you have a meeting with an employee has a meeting with his or her manager at the end of the year, and the manager says, well, you're not doing very well, I don't know, communicating, or you're not very organized, or whatever it is that the feedback, let's call it developmental feedback is. Well, if it's only coming from one person, your manager, it's very easy for us to say, well, it's just because this person is having a problem with me, because this person's personality is very different from mine. And you know what? That could very easily be true. We should not be only getting feedback from our managers, because guess what? Feedback from managers usually is really, really biased. In fact, some of the research done on 360s show that the feedback from the manager is about the least reliable you have. It's only reliable for one thing, and that is to tell you whether you're likely to be promoted or not. With there, the managers are pretty good. But actually telling you how good you are in your job, your peers, the people working directly with you, of course, if you're a manager yourself or if you're a leader yourself, the people who report to you, those people would be able to know that much, much better. It would be like asking, I don't know, ask the dean, uh, Dr. McMahill, somebody I respect very much, but if you ask her how good of a professor I am, will she know that, or will my students know that better? So she will know it secondhand. My students will know it firsthand. So that kind of shows you how getting information from multiple sources might be a very good idea. Okay. And finally, with the 360, you get some very actionable information, and usually it comes in categories. So you don't just get information on one particular area, or you're told in general that you need improvement or that you're going above and beyond. You're told very specifically, okay, on this competency area, you're doing absolutely great and you should capitalize on that. But on this other competency area, maybe you should be working on a little bit more. So, of course, as I say this, I'm assuming that we're dealing with a good instrument, because if we're dealing with a bad instrument and the categories are not well put together, then forget that I said that you could get specific information on areas of improvement. Later, we're going to talk a little bit about the instrument itself, and you'll see what I'm talking about. Okay. So before I go on, I'm curious, could you send me some chats on any other pros? In particularly, do you have any good stories or success stories, things that happened because people in your organization participated in a 360 or you participated in a 360 that you wouldn't mind sharing? Wait a minute just to see if anybody has a good story. If nobody has a good story, that's going to be a little concerning to me. Okay. What will be interesting is when I ask you if you have a bad story, if you have them. Oh, okay, one person has one. Let's see what I have here. Okay, so what one person said is that uh, a 360 helped a manager see positive attributes. Um, Somebody heard from colleagues that it was actually that they appreciated the opportunity. One person loved having the opportunity to have the voice, his or her voice heard, and that is a pretty common feedback, by the way, that people sometimes they like the opportunity, they enjoy the opportunity to speak up. It's kind of bringing this back to my world, to the world of professors and student evaluations and so on. There's this big debate on whether student evaluations are effective or not effective, and there are pros and cons, just like a 360, because it's kind of like a 360 anyway. And one of the pros and one of the reasons that we always keep it is because people want to have a voice. They want to have the opportunity to speak up. And if you take away that opportunity, it feels, I don't know, pretty dictatorial. Okay. And then finally, one of you said that effective coaching is essential after the 360 takes place. And that's absolutely true. When we go through best practices, and we'll talk a little bit more about that, that process and why it's important. Okay, so now let's go through some of the cons. And I hope that the cons don't scare you, because the cons are manageable. But going through the cons will explain some of my best practices that I will share later on. Okay, the first one has to do precisely with what the person who just sent the chat about coaching. It has to do with some of what she was saying. Development, there is some good evidence that development takes place, that leaders can actually become better leaders after a 360 process. But I'm saying a 360 process, not just a 360 assessment. So just having a 360 assessment and receiving the results without further coaching and without some development is not likely to do any good. Okay, so that's one thing to keep in mind. And I find it actually surprising that so many organizations would actually run a 360 process and not have a follow-up process, a follow-up to it, because it can be pretty costly. So you're having a big investment, and you could actually do harm instead of good by having just the assessment and giving people the results. So that's the first no-no. The second problem is that almost in general, I wouldn't say always, but in general, 360 processes are anonymous. There are some people who advocate for making them not anonymous, but I am not one of the people who advocate for that, because you're unlikely to get honest results except for very, very specific circumstances. So because it's anonymous, people could feel, I don't know, there's a certain psychology behind being able to give anonymous feedback. And what often happens is that people pay far less attention to how they are giving feedback, what they are writing, what they are saying, and thus you could have some pretty negative feedback that could be very discouraging. And in general, that stuff is not filtered. Most of the feedback, most of the 360 processes that I've seen, or 360 assessments that I've seen, when you enter, for example, open-ended answers, those are not filtered or grouped or qualitatively analyzed, because, as you can imagine, it would be too costly, too time consuming to do that. They are simply grouped randomly without the respondent's name. So you get exactly what people answered. And sometimes people answer, well, sometimes people are not very nice. Okay. So that's something to keep in mind. And it will have something, I will bring it back when I talk about the kinds of preparation, the kinds of training that you should have before a 360 process. One other large set of problems has to do with the validity of the results. And when I say validity, what I mean is, what questions are people really answering? Are they answering the questions that you're asking, or are they answering the questions they think you're asking, or the questions that they think of when they read the other question? That is probably confusing to you, so let me give you some examples. Let's say that your 360 is asking a variety of questions about the person's competency in, I don't know, organizing the work, or how good the person is in strategic planning, or whether this person is creative. It's possible that what people are answering is not, is this person creative, but do I like this person? Or am I happy in this job in general? Do I like what this person did yesterday? So you can have some biases in terms of, it's called recency bias, something that happened yesterday, or you could have primacy bias, the very first thing the person did. So there are all sorts of biases that take place, especially when, as is very common, organizations start sending 360 assessments kind of willy-nilly without paying very close attention to whether the people answering the assessment actually know the person whom they are rating. So you start getting all sorts of wacky results. Also, sometimes if you're evaluating a leader, sometimes the person is simply answering, I don't think this person deserves to be where he or she is, because I think I deserve his or her spot. So as you can see, there are various kinds of questions people could be answering. And those are not necessarily the questions you asked, but those are the answers you get. And I hope I'm making some sense. If I'm not, and if I need to stop and explain something again, please do not hesitate to let me know. I don't mind at all. Okay. Now, why is it that we have those issues with validity? Well, it's not only because people are answering weird questions that you ever asked. There are also some other issues. First, very often organizations select a fairly small sample of raters. So it's not uncommon, let's say that your leader has, I don't know, 20 subordinates. Usually not all 20 are included. And I can tell you that from where I stand. I've coordinated several 360 processes in my day. I have administratively set them up myself, and it's very time consuming. You have to enter everybody's email, and you have to send a bunch of follow-ups, and then people have issues with the computer, and then something doesn't work and they don't understand the assessment. So it's very, very time consuming. And because it's time consuming, one way for you to reduce the amount of time that you spend on the process is by minimizing the number of raters. And that creates a problem, see, because now you could have a situation or a result that is just by chance. When we do research, one of the things that we are trained to do, that we learn to do, is to see what percentage of a particular population we need in order to be able to trust the results and say that the results are not just by chance. So for example, if I have, I don't know, 100 people, there are some tables that tell me what percentage of those 100 people do I need to have so as to be able to trust my results. I'm going to see if I can hunt for that and also put a link on my website for you to see later. One of the things that you see when you go into the link that I find is that if you have a very small group of people to begin with, if your population has only about 20 or 30 people, you basically need to have almost all of them if you're going to trust the results. You definitely cannot only stick to 3 or 4. And unfortunately, that's very often what happens. Let me give you an example. Imagine that I have that common common Likert scale, in which 1 means this person is absolutely horrible and 5 means this person is God. You know, we've all seen those, right? And imagine that we are rating manager Jane Doe, and Jane Doe is being rated by 5 different people. And Jane Doe gets a 3.4 out of 5. Well, what does that 3.4 mean? And you see that depending on what the distribution of scores are, you could have very different scenarios and still have a 3.4. One of the things that happens is that if we're only reporting the means, if we're only reporting the averages, as in this case 3.4, we don't know if Jane Doe was godlike to 3 people and the absolute worst manager in the world for 2, if she was a pretty good manager for 4 and just 1 person doesn't like her, if she was kind of mediocre for 4 people and godlike to 1. You see, these numbers here are telling you very different stories. But in general, in 360s, we only report the average, which wouldn't be an issue if we had most of our people accounted for, and if we had a way to actually get rid of the so-called outliers, or the numbers that are too different from the way that everybody else reported. But again, that would be too costly, so that's not something that we usually do. So you may say, well, okay, there's a solution to that. So what you do then is you report not the mean, not the average, but the frequency. You say, for example, that I'm kind of laughing here because I have 5 and then I have 4 people. That should be a 4. Sorry about that. But let's say that in 5 people, 4 of them said that she is godlike, and 1 person said that she is terrible. This is a fairly common way of reporting 360s, and I am curious if you guys, oops, sorry, I should not have done that. Okay, let me go back to where I was. Could I have somebody tell me what the problem could be with something like that? So if you receive the response for your 360 and you know that 4 people think you're horrible and 1 person thinks, or 4 people think you're great and 1 person thinks you're horrible, can anybody tell me what the problem would be with that scenario? Okay, there's somebody who answered. Let's see. The person just doesn't like you, of course. Halo effect. All right. Any other problems? What happens after the manager sees that result? Think about that. Okay, I'm not getting anybody to see it. Think about that, guys. Aha, yeah, somebody said you may be able to figure out who the one is and lose anonymity. Bingo. That's exactly it. So, I mean, let's face it. Let's say that you have 5 subordinates and everything is going great, but there is this one person who you can't ever do anything right. When you look at your results in the 360, don't you think you're going to know who that person is? So anonymity is gone. And you know what happens when anonymity is gone that way? You can't trust the results anymore. You can't even trust that those 4 people actually think you're like God because they know that they could be identified otherwise. So it's if you present the, let me go back to where I was before. If you present the means, you don't know how that where that mean is coming from. And if you just present the frequencies, then you could destroy anonymity. And I don't have a slide for that, but if you present the actual words that people used, what actually people said, the qualitative responses, which is usually a best practice to have it in the 360 process. But if you do and you don't train people beforehand, then what could happen is you would get the people might not be trained to do it right, and the person being rated could feel discouraged. It could actually do damage to the team environment afterwards. Another issue is this. Remember when I said that managerial reports, the way that the manager sees you is very often biased by a variety of issues, and not very accurate. In fact, as a researcher, I know not to trust too much what managers say. When you do research, if you can rely on 360 data, it's usually a much stronger research design because you can trust it more than just information from the manager. The people who actually know you the best in general, with some exceptions, are the peers. Like in my case, that wouldn't be true because my peers don't see me in the class like my students do. But in general, in the workforce, the people who know the best how people are doing on their jobs are the peers. The problem is peers could be reluctant to speak up. They are nervous about being unsupportive. So that's the quote from a researcher called Piperl. He says that the peers may be reluctant to speak up. They're torn between being supportive colleagues or hard-nosed judges. So peers may be nervous about what's going to happen after they present the information. And the other issue is that we could be focusing too much on the individual, and that could compromise group work, especially if things are not very well done. Especially if we don't train people and we don't prepare them to be diplomatic. And if you're not very careful, you could actually do harm to teamwork after the process. So this is another quote from Piper. If most work is done in groups, focusing on individuals can compromise the group's performance or make a weak team's performance even worse. So you could be doing harm. Rather than cultivating a sense of shared ownership and responsibility, the process can breed deep cynicism, suspicion, and an us against them mentality. So keep in mind, I am not going through all those cons so that you can leave this program convinced that 360s are horrible ideas, because they are not. The research on 360s suggests that they can actually be very, very powerful. They just have to be handled with care. So in summary, the application of a 360 instrument can lead to great return on investment through the development of employee competencies. And however, these returns will only occur if the steps are thought through, properly implemented, and assessed throughout the process. In other words, when we go into the best practices, you'll see that this is not a simple, let me just hire, I don't know, Mr. Joe Blow consultant and ask Mr. Doe to, I don't know, run the process, and then I'll never pay any attention to it again. It doesn't work that way, and if you do it that way, you could actually cause some harm. Before I go into the actual good practices, I'm wondering if anybody has any input, any insight, any questions before I move on. And I don't think anybody has anything to say, so I'm going to move on into the best practices. So, how do you handle it? How do you maximize the chances that it's actually going to be helpful and minimize the chances that you're going to have some of the problems in validity and group dynamics and all that stuff that I've been talking about? First, remember that this is not a set it and forget it process. It is going to take some work. And if what you want to do is set it and forget it, then the best way to handle it is to just make it available on a voluntary basis for individuals and let them handle their own thing, because otherwise you could actually be causing some harm. So let's first talk about the instrument itself. A question that I very often am asked is, can you create your own instrument? Because one thing about 360s is that it can be pretty expensive. I am curious if anybody in the audience has some range of prices to share with us. I can share, while you guys are thinking, I can tell you what I know, where I come from. In general, I would say the price is probably going to be somewhere starting on $250 per person being rated, not necessarily per rater. And that's on the low end, and it does not include the consulting, the administrative costs, any coaching afterwards, anything else. That's just the instrument and putting people on in the rosters and so on. Does anybody have different prices that you wouldn't mind sharing with us so that we have some kind of a range? Raise your hands if you're surprised when I say that the price starts at about $250 per person being rated. Does that surprise you? Okay, I have several people raising their hands. All right, now I'm going to ask you to raise your hands if you think that this value is high. How many of you think that's expensive? Okay, a couple of you raised your hands. It's and it's actually, what's interesting is that that's actually on the low end, and that's precisely why people in general don't do it. It's because they are nervous about the costs involved, and that's why often it's only something done for people in the higher ranks. So could you do it yourself? Could you create your own instrument and then register for one of the survey companies that provide 360 processes? One advice that I would have, I don't have a slide for that, but I will say it right away. If you choose to do it yourself, if you choose to create your own instrument and handle your own process, make sure that you select a survey company that has a 360 survey process. It's not enough to just go to SurveyMonkey or to, I don't know even if SurveyMonkey has changed. The last time I checked, they didn't have a 360 process. Go to one that has specifically a 360 function. I know Qualtrics has one. I'm not going to remember by heart the other names. I have them if anybody wants to contact me. Because if you choose a normal survey, it's a mess. It doesn't create the reports automatically. The calculations are messy to make, and so on. But let's talk first about the instrument itself. One thing that you should know is that creating an instrument is not just a matter of, oh, let me put some questions together and make sure that they work, and that's it. So it's a pretty time-consuming process. The first thing that you have to do is come up with the questions, and usually the questions come from a very thorough research of the literature on the particular competencies that you're working on. Sometimes the questions also come from internal research. For example, you can send a questionnaire to all the people in your company asking about the qualities of a strong leader, and then you could see some of those items and use them in your survey. Not unusual for it to be a combination of those two things, a review of the literature and some kind of an internal research. That's to create the questions to begin with. Second, usually we find a panel of experts who will actually analyze your questions and make sure that your questions are actually measuring what you think they're measuring. So for example, if your survey is trying to measure, I don't know, sociability and ability to network, but you're asking questions that seem to have to do with, I don't know, how tired you are at the end of the day, then you have the wrong question. So you usually would then look for a panel of experts who really understand sociability and ability to network, and ask them to evaluate your items. If there are existing questions out there, you can use them if you get the author's permission, and a lot of those things are proprietary. The good news for you is that very often professors and researchers, they create instruments for their research, and even though those items are not up for grabs without the person's permission, and they often have a cost, the cost is often much lower than if you were to buy a proprietary instrument by itself. Okay, the third thing that you do then is that you send it to, you test your questions with a sample, first a small sample just to make sure that at least people are understanding what you're asking, and then you send it to a large sample, and then you make some statistical analysis to make sure everything is working, and then typically you run it again. So and that is, I'm giving you kind of a very, very brief shortcut. Actually creating an instrument can be more complicated than that, but even looking at all those steps, you see that this is not just something simple to do. And if you don't have time to do it well, then it's the classic garbage in, garbage out, in which you are asking a bunch of questions, but you have no idea if people understand your questions, if your questions are actually measuring what you think you're measuring. You could get pretty meaningless results. Okay. If you do choose to create your own instrument, here are a few tips. And these tips, by the way, are also helpful if you choose somebody else's instrument, but you want to make sure that that instrument is sound, that that's a good instrument. And by the way, goes without saying, but if you decide to go through a 360 process with a vendor or a company, I don't care with whom, make sure that you pay attention to that instrument. Ask to participate in the process yourself first. See how it feels like to answer those questions. Ask, if possible, ask to see the actual questions, because if you just answer them as an instrument, as a ratee, they may go too fast for you to be able to actually evaluate them. Okay, so the first thing is clarity. The items must be crystal clear. And that's one of the things that we do when we test and pilot the instrument, is to make sure that that people interpreted from the, I'm kind of babbling here, but that people actually interpreted your questions as intended. If you ask people, what do you think I meant by this question, the response is making sense. That sometimes is done when you're building instruments as well. Okay, the second seems pretty obvious. It's very well known. How many of you know that, for example, that when you ask a question, you shouldn't have two questions in the same question? Raise your hands if you've heard this before. Okay, so several of you are raising your hands. The idea is that you don't want a double-barreled question. Everybody knows that, and yet it is so common. I see so many instruments. For example, here's the example that I have below. Does your manager recognize your efforts and help you succeed? Well, guess what? These are two different questions. The manager could recognize the efforts, but not help you succeed for some other reason, right? So one question per question is an absolute must. But even if your question only has one question, that's not enough, because, for example, in the example that I just gave before, does your manager recognize your efforts and help you succeed? Help you succeed could have various interpretations, and we don't know which interpretation is given by the person. So unless you have a qualitative answer following every single quantitative question, and we usually don't because it would make the survey too long, I don't know what to make of this particular question. So the question has to be clear. There has to be only one question per question, and the interpretation has to be clear. And there's no way that you know that just by instinct. Usually we have to test the instrument and see if that's actually working. One thing that normally we recommend is that the instrument have a non-response item. In other words, you should be able to have a not applicable, or do not know, or have not observed, or something along those lines. Because otherwise what happens, if you don't have that kind of non-response item, what happens is that people tend to answer neuter, or if you have a neutral. If you have a scale that goes 1 to 5, you would choose 3, but that 3 would be meaningless. 3 doesn't mean that the person is moderately good and moderately bad in that particular competency or task or behavior. It just means the person doesn't know what to answer. Okay, so that's an absolute must. Also, the questions, you have to make sure that the questions are actually observable. So, for example, does your manager believe in you? How does the person observe that? How do we know what the manager believes? So you have to write the questions in a way that the person doing the rating actually is able to answer them appropriately. Let's see, where am I? Face validity. The idea of face validity is that when the person completes the assessment, the questions make sense. And the instrument looks like it's measuring what you said would be measured. So for example, if you say that you're measuring your manager's competence in networking, you would expect the questions to have something to do with networking. Here's one problem. One major difference between a typical 360 and other types of assessments is that typically the person being tested, the person being rated, has access to all the items. When the person receives a 360 report, it's not unusual for every single item to be listed and for you to see what is the average for each of the groups participating for each of the questions. So what that means is that if the questions don't make sense, then the results are not going to be accepted. So if I look at questions on networking and I see things on my, I don't know, on things that I think have nothing to do with networking, I'm unlikely to accept the results, even if you did some studies beforehand and statistically you could tell me that that question actually does have a strong relationship with networking. If it doesn't look like it does, I'm not going to accept the results, which causes a problem, a different kind of problem, which is social desirability bias. The trick is to create a question that looks like it has something to do with what you're testing, but that doesn't look so obvious that people are likely to all answer the same way. So for example, if you ask the question, is your manager honest? Unless you hire some very weird people, you're probably going to get a very, very strong resounding yes, at which point I'm not really sure that you're getting the answer that you're looking for. Are you really asking honest? What do you mean by honest? So you need to ask the question in a way that the answer is not obvious so that you get some variation there. Okay, so those were just a few things that I wanted to say about the instrument. And if you open my PowerPoint later on, you'll see that even my notes, my script is under the slides. So that would allow you to review some of the things that I just said if I spoke too fast. Okay, now I talked about the instrument, right? But let's talk about the process. And I'm going to go back to what the participants said very early on, that coaching is very important. Yes, coaching is very important. Resources in general are very important. So one question that you need to ask yourself if you're running a 360 process is if you have all the resources needed for training people, for analyzing the results, and for coaching. Okay, so this is one quote that you can read on the screen. Organizations should be aware of the commitment necessary to go through the process in a way that will achieve the maximum benefits. If the organization is unprepared or ill-equipped to go through the necessary steps and complete the follow-up, the results may be worse than the circumstances the company had to start with. So I can't emphasize this enough. You could do some real harm if you don't know what you're doing. The very first thing you need to consider is training prior to the process. And when I say training, I mean training for the people completing the instrument on behalf of somebody else and people whose instrument is being completed. I'm not talking about some complicated training, but at the very least, some very good information. Throughout my career, it doesn't matter where, I've been in various organizations in the past, it wasn't unusual for me to receive a 360 instrument or a request to help evaluate a colleague or help evaluate a supervisor with no information whatsoever. I didn't know what that was going to be used for. I didn't know if I could potentially be hurting my colleague's bonus or salary or promotion chances. So at that point, the question that I end up by answering is, do I care enough about my colleague or my supervisor so as not to want to hurt his or her feelings? That's the answer that's the question I was answering. None of the questions I was asked I was actually answering. So that's what happens when you don't provide sufficient orientation information to people who are going to participate in the 360 process. You might also want to train people in the art of giving feedback that is actually going to do good and not harm. On the consequences of giving feedback that could be perceived as discouraging. It's a balancing act because you don't want to make people feel so bad about the process that all of a sudden you're not getting honest results. But it is important to train people to be honest and direct and helpful and not hurtful. And that could make a difference between having a successful process or not. Uh, all those things improve the safety. So training people, informing people what's going to happen with the instrument, what's going to be done with their responses, whether it's anonymous or not, all those things improve the safety. There's one particular piece of safety that is very important, and that's the safety of the people being rated, and that has to do with your purpose. What is your purpose doing the process? Is it developing or is it evaluating and promoting? How many of you have participated in 360s in which the purpose was actually to decide who was going to be promoted, or the purpose was going to be to decide what your bonus was? Any of those things, that the consequence, yeah, and I see one hand, two hands. Okay. It's not uncommon for 360s to be used that way. And what I would say is don't. I'm very direct about that one. Ideally, you should be using 360s for developmental purposes, because if you're using them to determine compensation and personnel decisions, it's very likely that what you're getting is bogus information. It should be used for development only, because otherwise, this is coming from that same researcher I told you about before. Many organizations, raters expressed reservations about providing critical feedback when they knew it would directly influence another salary. So people simply lie. Okay, so it should be for development only. And if the goal is for development only, then ideally only the person and his or her coach should be looking at those results. And I'm going to be even more revolutionary here, and I'm going to say that if the goal is development only, then you should allow the person to select his or her own raters. Now, as I say that, I already see people asking, well, but won't people cheat? Won't people choose only people who like them so as to doctor the results? Well, it's possible, but remember, this is not going to be used for the person's promotion, and nobody other than the person, him or herself, and his or her coach is going to be seeing those results. So why would the person cheat? And because the person selected his or her own raters, it's possible for that person to select fewer people and still trust the results. Think about it this way. Imagine that you have people who really care about you at work, people whom you really trust, people whose judgment you trust, your mentors, your colleagues, people who only want the best for you. You ask them to be honest because this is going to help you develop and grow. How likely are they to be honest if they know that you're the only person seeing that, you and your coach? So as you see, it sounds like this is something that wouldn't work, but it actually can work quite well. And finally, I'm going to end where we started with, which was what your colleague said in the beginning. Having some coaching is absolutely essential. And if you don't have money for expensive coaches from the outside, well, maybe you can have a coaching training process for volunteer coaches, peer coaches, or some sort of a process so that coaching will be available, even if it's not available in the traditional, let's hire an outside executive coach system. Okay, so you need to have some coaching, whatever it is. So in other words, it is a puzzle with many pieces. It can be extremely enriching. There are ways for you to do it cheaper, I guess, than what is normally charged. I personally came across an organization that allows people to create their own set up their own system and invite their own raters, and I don't have anything to do with the organization. Like, I don't represent them. I gain nothing out of recommending them. But it's just a group of people that I like, and I'm their client myself. It's called Self-Stir, and that can be very, very cost effective. I'm sure there are other systems out there that that allow you to do it for a cheaper price and therefore allow you to expand this to more people. But just as you do that, remember, it's not just a simple process. It's not a set it and forget it. It does require some good thinking. So a few takeaways. Take the process seriously, devote enough time and energy, use a valid instrument, provide training and preparation for feedback, consider the safety, follow up, and provide coaching opportunities. So these are the things that I wanted you to know.